you see, in the Persian Gulf. And I said, I'm not going. He said, why aren't you going? I said, well, I went to 22 different bloody countries during the war. And I know Aden. He said, did you go there? I said, no, I didn't. I said, but I know it's only got one tree and it's reputed that somebody ran into that. And he said, well, it's not that bad. He said, well, then it's part of your contract that you've got to go to Aden. So I said, well, I'm not going to Aden. So he said, well, I don't want you to go to Aden, because if you go to Aden, who am I going to play chess with, you see? And it was my boss, this, you see. So I said, well, that's hard luck. If I go to Aden, you won't have anybody. And I said, if I don't go to Aden, you won't. So he said, no. Oh, well. He said, won't you change your mind? I said, no, I'm not going to Aden. And so on. And he said, well, you might have to leave us. I said, well, I might have to. And I thought, well, I'll go back in the printing trade, do something like that. Anyway, about 3 days later, he sent for me. He said, the stationery office will have you. I said, what do you mean? He said, they've agreed, they'll take you, see, in the stationery office. So I said, oh, good. And that's how I went to the stationery office.
So you weren't purged then?
Well, I tried to be, but that didn't work. Well, with this Aden business, you know, I said, well, I want to leave the Air Ministry. He said, you can't leave the Air Ministry. I said, yes, I can. He said, no, you can't. I said, well, I'm a communist, you see. So he said, no, you're not. I said, yes, I am. He said, no, you're not. I said, I am. I said, you tell them. I said, and then they'll purge me and they'll send me to another ministry. So he said, well, if you tell me officially, I've got to tell them. So he told them. And the funny thing is, in the Air Ministry, they didn't like Persian people, and they wouldn't do it. And there was a tale of this bloke in Leicester, and he was quite active in the Communist Party in Leicester. So they decided that he came up for overseas posting. So they sent him to Singapore. So somebody said, oh, it's a bloody awful journey by air to Singapore. Get your doctor to say you're not well enough to go by air. Say it wouldn't suit you, and so on. And he said, what would that do? He said, oh, then they send you by sea. So he did it. He got a 3-month bloody voyage by sea to Singapore. Lovely, you know, like cruise ship. When he got to Singapore, gets off the ship, goes to the office, reports, then goes and joins the Singapore Communist Party. And Singapore, they picked it up straight away. And within a week, they've got him back on the bloody ship, sent him back to England. So he gets back to England, goes to Leicester, and he comes up to the chief in the Air Ministry. And they come up, and he says, and the chief says, what's this then? He said, well, you've got to get rid of him from the Air Ministry because he's a communist. And this bloke said, he said, these bloody Labour people, they always want to interfere with people's rights and freedom. So, and he said, let's have a look at his record. And he said, he's got a bloody good war record, this bloke. He said, I'm not having it. So they wouldn't purge him. He still kept his job. You know, bugger had a free bloody holiday on a ship and everything. And the Air Ministry was like that. And when I said it, they said, all right, that's all right, leave it, do nothing. They weren't prepared to do it, you see. And it just shows if they stood up to how these people could do it. No, it was because I wouldn't go to, and it was 1958 that we started the business of stopping pensions being done by a plea to Parliament, and had it changed over to relating to the pay of the individuals. And then Thatcher switched it over to prices. And the Labour Party never undid it. Well, she worked for the Communist Party in Bristol, and when I came from Bournemouth, I was propaganda secretary for the Hampshire area, south of England, and that's how I came to the district office where she was working. That's where I met her. And then,
Do you know why she joined the Communist Party?
well, family, her mother and sister and brother-in-law, you know, it was they were linked to the party from quite long before I knew them, you know. And I think she was in it during the war as well, because the police tried to get her sacked from some firm. So obviously she was in it, yeah. Fortunately, you know, the police used to try and get rid of people, and often the reaction was to just disregard the police and not believe them. A bit like today, really, isn't it? They're bloody useless. Well, of course we went. There was at Timsbury near Bristol. There was a big school, you know, where it was owned by quite a big estate, and they used to have sort of weekend get-togethers and speakers come and so on, and some quite well-known ones like Tommy Jackson, who he wrote Ireland Their Own, which is a famous publication about the history of Ireland, and he was just an ordinary working man who wrote that, and he was a printer actually in his time, but there were lots of people who used to come there, like, you know, Harry Pollitt and Haldane and all sorts of quite top
But
people.
did you have the same sort of views as Mum, or did you have different approaches and things?
No, we're more or less the same. We try and persuade the Labour government to do more progressive in its approach, not to compensate so lavishly the mine owners and the shareholders in the railways, and you know, these things that were bankrupt were being bought by the government at about 100 times more than they were worth. And in the case of the miners, the charge against the mining industry of the previous owners was so high that it almost made the coal expensive. And, you know, and there were campaigns like that. There was campaigns, the peace campaign in general. The CND campaign was prevalent at that time against atomic weapons and so on. The campaign to try and get the Americans out of Britain, you know, where they...
In 1948 you went to a peace conference in Paris.
That's right, yeah.
What was that about? Was there anything worth saying about
Well, it was a World Peace Conference. The first thing we went to was a Bastille Day celebration. That's the first time we went to Paris, and then when we went to the peace conference, that was a year afterwards, actually. I don't know.
Did you meet people from the resistance there?
Yes.
So who did you meet then?
Well, we met George and Suzanne, who we stayed with in their flat, and he was an electrician, but he was in the resistance, and he was reputed to have shot some German officer on one of the stations in, I don't know whether it was called Stalingrad Station, it was eventually, I don't know whether they still do, I mean.
No, it is. It's a metro station called Stalingrad.
A metro station. It used to be called Stalingrad. I don't know. Is it still?
Yeah.
Oh.
Well, he shot a German officer there.
Yeah. And his wife, Suzanne, she joined the Communist Party during the German occupation. And then they had a friend called Rose, and she was a very nice woman, very, very courageous, and she got arrested by the Gestapo and taken to their headquarters to be interrogated, and she said it was a bit like an ordinary police station, and they were all sitting on benches waiting to be called in to be interrogated, and she suddenly thought, well, nobody knows anybody here, you see, so she waited for an opportunity and just sort of stood up, walked out, and then ran and buggered off and went to the country and got out their way and evaded, what do you call it? And they had certificates of their resistance work, and they were signed by two main signatories, Chief of Police and General Secretary of the Communist Party, to say they were resistance workers. Very good people, very, very good. Well, I found the civil service fairly good actually, because I don't think we were badly treated. You know, because the civil service, it had very progressive trade unions, so we were fairly well defended. And most of the civil service unions had either communists or communist sympathiser, full-time officers and representatives. And like myself, for instance, I fairly quickly became section president in the HM stationery office, and I held a job, and people stood against me, didn't beat me for 5 years, and I only left it when I got promoted and went into the executive grade, which was a different union, and I was always active, and the only time, I would say generally, the civil service itself was very, very fair and treated people well. I can remember a colleague who was in the International Brigade, went on a promotion board, and on the promotion board they said to him, they said, Mr. Longstaff, tell us about your political activity, you see. So he sort of thought, well, they don't know much about me.
Yeah.
So he more or less said he was active in the union and he did this and he was, you know, always very progressive and so on. And one of the board said, yes, but Mr. Longstaff, you fought in the International Brigade in Spain, you're a member of the Communist Party. And he said, bloody hell, you know more about it than me. and the reports were there, but they didn't affect, he got his promotion, no, it didn't stop him. But the only time that I was victimised was quite late. I was a higher executive officer, I was an executive officer at the time, and it was at the time when Peter Walker was the minister, and he came and he refused to accept a petition against the government's pay restrictions, and a minister on the MPNI had been to South Wales and had accepted a petition from the staff openly and reasonably, and he wouldn't. So when I was in contact with him, I said, if he won't accept it, we won't accept him. And if he comes to open our building, we walk out. So then they had a message from one of his minions to say that he would accept the petition, but behind closed doors, so as nobody could see it and anything like that. So we said, well, we've nothing to hide. What have you got to hide? So we won't do that. And then they send the police down when he comes, a bloody coachload of police, and I protest to them, and I'll go to the police and say, what do you lot want, you know? And they said, we're here to protect you. We don't want protecting. And he said, you do? He said, there's anarchists about. And I said, I'm sure there's anarchists about. Anybody in the civil service with being run like this is an anarchist. You can't believe in government. And I thought, he doesn't know what an anarchist was, even the policeman. Anyway, the police were there, but they didn't do anything. He went in and they were going to have a meeting in one of the meeting rooms. And as he was going in, there were reporters following on. And there was a girl reporter from the Daily Worker there. And we called over to her and we said, as soon as we start our meeting, draw attention to us. And she said, right, I'll do that. And what happened actually was they went into this room and they all settled down in the meeting room, and we were out on the lawn in front of the building, and you know, and our branch chairman was opening the meeting, and this girl stood up and pointed out the window, and she said, "What's going on out there? I want to know what's going on." And that ruined his meeting and so on. But about 10 months later, I was due for a promotion, boarding for the next higher grade, and so was Jim, my colleague, and I got a board and I went for promotion, and then the result came out and I wasn't going to be promoted. So because I'd not been very well, I asked for a reboarding on the grounds I was taking antibiotics and perhaps I didn't do as well as I should. And a colleague called Jewel, he's dead now, so it doesn't matter, he rang me up and he said, "What do you want another board for, Jeff?" I said, "Because," I said, "you know the rules, I'm entitled to one if I was being medicated and or not well enough to have done as well as I should." And he said, "You passed the board, and so did Jim." So I said, "Well, and why aren't we being promoted?" He said, "Well, I can't tell you over the phone because it may be tapped. This is, you know, minister phones." And so he said, "Come to London and see me." So I went up and saw Bob Jewell, and he said, "There's nothing we can do about it." He said, "Peter Walker's put a top document on you both, not to be promoted for 18 months because of what you did to him when you..." So I said, "Well, let's take it to Parliament, let's do the bastard, you know." He said, "Do you think you get promoted if you do that?" And so I said, "Well, no, I suppose not." I said, "But it's not right that he gets away with it." He said, "It's not the only thing he's getting away with." So he persuaded me to do nothing, because he said, "In 2 months' time it's off." He said it was only on for 18 months. He said, "You'll be on a board, and so would Jim, and we bloody will get you through." And that was it. And that's how I got the promotion. I was a clerical officer in 1958 in Bristol. I discovered that pensions of civil servants was determined by a plea to Parliament. So somebody, and there wasn't even an organisation doing it, would put up a plea that the pensions of the civil servants, ex-civil servants, should be adjusted to keep up with the cost of living or to, you know, rising costs. And if Parliament felt generous, it would do it. But there was no history of it feeling generous or anything. And of course, this was 58. I'd been 3 years fairly active in the union. And I said, well, that's the wrong way of determining pensions. It should be, since they take the money from our pay for the pensions, it should be related to pay. So we put a motion up to conference from Bristol Stationery Office. And when it got to conference, you think, oh, well, everybody will agree with that. But they didn't. And it was opposed by the executive of the union for reasons that I couldn't clearly understand. So I had a friend called Alex McMaster who was on the executive, and he was a communist and a good friend of mine. And Alex said, "Your motion comes up after the coffee break, doesn't it?" So I said, "Yeah, that's right, Alex." He said, "Well, what do you think of your chances?" I said, "Well, very good, I think." He said, "You know that the executive's opposing it, do you?" I said, "On what grounds?" He said, "Well, there are all sorts of technical grounds. They think we ought to go about it in a different way or something." I said, "I'm not saying how to go about it at all. I'm saying we've got to start a new system." He said, "Yeah, I know all about your motion." And he said, "But they've got..." And he pointed to some bloke. He said, I've forgotten his name. "He's going to speak against you." And he was one of the good speakers, you see. Anyway, Alex McMaster pointed out that this bloke had gone off and left his notes for his speech on the desk. So he said, let's have a look at them, he says. So he said, yeah, you have a look at them. And I had a look at this bloke's notes. And so I made a note of all the things he was going to say in opposition to what I said, you see. So I changed my speech and made my speech the same as his opposition, but with the positive side, you see. And it was a bit unfair, I know, but I was there to win it, not to bloody play the game and that. And so I moved it on the grounds that, you know, and the true grounds that the fairness was, if you had a pension system related to pay, the pensions themselves should be related to pay, you know, argued it out. But I used all the things that, and I managed to use all the headings he put for himself. So when it came his turn to reply, it was causing people to laugh because he was saying the same thing I said, and I won it. Well, then shortly after that, I left. I got promoted and had to go into the next union, into the society. So I had to do the same thing again there, and we proposed it. Well, then eventually we had it. It went to the national staff side, that's all the unions in the civil service, and it became national staff side policy. And then they had a Labour government, and they came up with their idea. And their idea was that instead of being related to pay, it would be related to the wages index, which was a bit of a compromise, but it was good progress. It meant that was it. And that's how it started, and that started in early 1960s. Well, when Thatcher came to power, she basically was against the pensions at all. She didn't like them at all. She wanted to reduce them, and she swapped it over from wages to prices, knowing that prices don't rise as fast as wages. And she also changed the month of determining what the amount should be from a high month of inflation to a low month of inflation. She did all those things quite deliberately to cut down the pensions. And she herself gets 5 civil service pensions. So she doesn't do badly, does she? The Communist Party always tried to tell people the truth about these things, and now not to always take as fact what the newspapers tell them, and to try to tell them the truth about it. And also, it was a fight against colonialism, wasn't it? It was a fight against... Britain seemed to want to be accepted as a democratic country and retain its empire. Churchill didn't want to get rid of India, for instance. He would have liked to retain India. And they used Stafford Cripps and Mountbatten and all sorts of other people to ease it through. But the old divide and rule thing did a lot of damage. That you know, between the Pakistan and India, so that instead of it being what it should have been one big united India. It ended up Pakistan and India. So the damage was done in the way they resisted it. Then other countries, they did get their independence of sorts when eventually Britain had to give it up. You know, we ceased to be able to retain it. Look, we never tried to tell the children, either of you, not to do religion at school. We never said that. We never ever tried to tell you to do anything at school. We expected you to behave at school as civilised people, as we would anywhere. We behaved civilised. We always believed in law. I always do. And if the law's wrong, I'll seek to change it. But I wouldn't break it until it's got rid of. You know, I might break it to try to get rid of it, but you know, I think it's basic. And we never did, but I mean, both of you didn't want to do religion. Well, that was all right. So therefore, we felt it necessary that we would support you. But I don't know. You tell me. When you were at school, you did far more things than I expected. I mean, this Cardiff Union of Secondary Schools that was organised, it was a fantastic organisation, that. I mean, there the kids could see more than the parents, they could see more than the council that was running the schools or anything. You could see how wasteful it was to have a girls' school and a boys' school, to have two science laboratories when one good one would do for both. The segregation of the sexes. They were against that. They were against school uniforms being rigidly, you know, must wear your school cap, you must do this, must do that, you know. And that was something. Why should we discourage good, progressive thought? And you yourselves related to good school teachers who reacted with you. And the bad ones react even worse. They're terrible. But that's the way. But we didn't influence. I don't think we told you not to do religion or anything. Did we?
I don't know.
We weren't religious. Why did we become religious? Just because you go to a school that wants you to be religious. You know. Why? Did you think we tried to influence you?
No. I was just wondering more about you. I remember you made a train for me, yeah?
Yes.
With a hammer and sickle on the front.
Yes.
Yeah? And how old was I then? So about 5 or 6, yeah? At 1957.
I didn't know there was a hammer and sickle. It could have been on the front. Well, I made that first of all for Jonathan. And then when he grew up and grew out of it, it came back and I remade it again and you had it. And it was a good train, that.
But it was a bit strange that it would be like painted red with a hammer and sickle at the height of the Cold War.
Oh, I see. Oh, well, I mean, the Cold War was for people who wanted it. It wasn't for everybody. And also, you know, the Cold War wasn't supported by the Daily Worker, or it wasn't supported by trade unions. You know, this was a Tory Cold War and an American Cold War. It was being imposed on people. They weren't enthusiastic for it. People weren't anti-Russian, really. But, I mean, the stories didn't do any good for the left-wing movement, obviously. They meant people that would be nice, useful for us, perhaps couldn't just come with us.
What was that you were telling us last night about the Soviet Friendship Society?
British Soviet Friendship Society?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I was secretary of it in Bristol, and I organised a big concert there, and in the Colston Hall, there were 2,000 people there. And we also had a visit of an astronaut, and you were there actually. And
What, Yuri Gagarin?
no, not Yuri Gagarin. That was in
60s,
Manchester, and Mum went to see Yuri Gagarin and met him. She met Yuri Gagarin.
Gagarin.
Yuri
Gagarin.
Yeah.
She met him?
She did. Mum did. Yeah.
She had his autograph, didn't she?
Yeah, she had it. Yeah, she had everything. Yeah.
Oh, so you get to meet the handsome black
Yeah.
man.
Oh, he
So
was.
but there was no cosmonauts then, was there? That early on?
No, not in the 50s.
There was no what?
Well, Yuri Gagarin was the first cosmonaut.
Oh yes, definitely. Yes, he was the first. And he came over. And there's a story in Manchester that they had these like Hyde Park, you know, open air speakers, and there was some religious speaker in Manchester standing on his soapbox, you know, giving his speech about religion, and there's a bloke in the crowd who was in the Plumbers Union, and the Plumbers Union had given membership to Yuri Gagarin, and when this bloke paused, he said, hey, one of my members, and he says, one of my members has been up there, and there's no there. Whatever it is, if you're the only one, or you think you're the only one, and you think there's something wrong that deserves to be challenged, you should challenge it. And I've seen it happen time and time again. We had, I could tell you his name in the union, and he was a conservative he was a conservative activist, and he was a full-time worker for the civil service union, well, not the civil service, the one I was in, the Society of Civil Servants, the executive union, and his name was Wheeler, and he was late coming to a meeting once, and we had one lad called Waggett. He's a, I think he's a priest now or something, or a vicar, but anyway, he was very unorthodox, but and he suddenly at the meeting, before the meeting started, whilst we were waiting for him to become, this secretary to turn up, he said, "I don't think much of John Wheeler." He said, "He's never doing his job fully and good enough for my big book," and so on. And everybody sort of went quiet because suddenly the main officer of the union has been challenged and not doing his job.
Yeah.
And then somebody else spoke up and said, "Yeah, well, when he came to Newcastle, we didn't think much of him, you see." And somebody else from, where was it, Cardiff, said they didn't think much of him. And before the bugger came, it was all set up, we were going to get rid of him.